If you could say hi if you're here, that would be great. And we're going to get going with questions finally. So, welcome everyone. It took me a minute there to get started and figure stuff out for y'all. Um, but here we are. And happy quarantine, everyone, or whatever you want to call it. Um, I just came back from getting groceries, and it was interesting. There was actually, I mean, it's Sunday, even though I guess days don't really matter anymore for many of us. Doesn't matter if it's Sunday or Monday or Friday or Wednesday, they're all the same day for many of us. Um, but it was, since it's Sunday, I guess people were out doing groceries. I needed to get a couple of groceries, so it was interesting to see how people respected space, how people were practicing social or physical distancing. It's true, I actually prefer the term physical distancing because social distancing means like ignoring people. And so I mean, I kind of prefer that idea that we don't ignore each other, we just keep our distance from each other. And even though, of course, the circumstances suck, that's an understatement. Um, I kind of appreciated having the extra space. I'm one of those people that when I'm standing in line or something, I hate it when someone's like right there. I've actually, in the past, I've turned around and told people like, can you like step back? Like you're breathing down my neck. Uh, so in that sense, I kind of appreciated all that space, and but it was also kind of weird because people were like, you know, coming down each other on the street and then doing this like, you know, dance of avoiding. And I recognize it's necessary, and um, but it was just strange. That's all. Um, but I was actually surprised how many people were outside. Also, part of this live stream, I thought it might be interesting because many of you have been asking about the status of Arcanum X, the deck, the Marseille deck that I started a while ago. Um, so I thought it might be interesting just to show you a little bit of the process of how I work on those cards. Um, the short answer for those of you asking about it is it's on hold right now. Um, of course, this situation also gives me lots of time, in a sense. So I will likely go back to working on it. But I have a lot of projects that I can spend my time on, all of which are kind of equally important in many ways to me. So um, the burden of having lots of creative ideas. Um, but basically, I reached a little bit of an impasse on Arcanum X because although I really love the way that the minors are going, the pips are going, um, I'm just I'm just not entirely sure how I want to deal with the people cards, the majors, and the court cards. So um, I have a few ideas about that, of course, and that's kind of the impasse. Is that I'm like, well, I could go this direction or I could go that direction. Sometimes creative things happen when you combine things. That's the principle of the three, the Empress. Um, but sometimes certain ideas belong separate. Um, one idea, one possible trajectory really belongs on its own as its own thing, and another trajectory also deserves its own thing. Um, or requires more, but more of something else that's not that other. So that's kind of where I'm at with Arcanum X. So I apologize for those of you who have been asking about it, or even those of you who haven't been asking about it, but who've been looking for it and have been excited about it, um, and just haven't had a chance, and haven't had any news on it. So that's the news, is there's no news, I guess. I know that's really unsatisfactory. Um, but I haven't abandoned the project. It's just on hold. It's there. It's just not um, on the very top of my priority list at the moment. The longer version of that is actually around about the shortly after I started working on it, and was making some really nice project progress on it. Um, my life significantly changed. My career life, my regular career life, significantly changed, which I won't go into too much detail here today about. Um, because it was actually a few years ago, and so in some ways I'm, you know, but it caused me to go in a bit of a different direction and do different things, which included working on the book, on my yoga book that I released, and all of that kind of stuff, and just focusing more on my yoga career. Of course, now with what's going on right now, yoga studios are closed. So I'm not going to stop teaching yoga. There's other ways of delivering instruction and assisting people with their practice, but uh, it's going to cause yet another change in my teaching. So that may also include another shift of focus back to some of my tarot stuff. So to that end, before I am going to get to those questions that were already asked, but before I get into that, just thought it might be interesting to show you like my process for Arcanum X. So I'll show you a card that I don't think I've shown yet. So I start with a template. Well, I start by kind of spreading out all of my Marseille decks out. And for people who collect and observe Marseille tarot, you know that you'll buy a new Marseille deck just because one card has a different color on a leaf or something. So I do have a fairly extensive Marseille collection. So I'll start by spreading out all my Marseille decks. I work on these large sheets of paper, which are the same aspect ratio as a tarot card. But just larger. It just gives me more space to work with. At the same time, for those of you who are working on creating your own deck, sometimes even though it's easier when something's bigger, I would generally advise not to go too big, because then it's really easy to get into really fine details on a big thing. And then when you scale it down to a card size, a lot of those details get lost. So I like working on a bigger scale, but I just don't want to work too big. So I start with a large piece of paper like that. And then I draw out a grid. And so this is actually the grid that's going to be for the Three of Coins. And I'm just, and I figure out what the spacing is. There's very geometrical stuff going on. I mean, that's one of the fascinating things about the Marseille when you really start studying it visually, is it's so graphic, it's so geometric, it's so mathematical. Even the aspect ratio on not all Marseille tarots, but many Marseille tarots is different than kind of what's become standard as tarot cards. It's slightly narrower and slightly longer for many, not all, but for many, and that just allows the geometry to happen in a bit of a different way. So I work with a grid and get the spacing, and I space out the objects first. So I'll space out, if it's 9 of cups, I'll space out the 9 of cups and draw the 9 cups first, and I'll draw those on one of these sheets with a sheet over top, and then I have a light table that I put behind so it bleeds through, and so I can draw my object spaced out. So in this case, in the 3 of coins, actually don't have the 3 of coins with just the coins on anymore because I already embellished it. But then, so I'll draw the object, so in this case 3 of coins, on this paper. Then after I have those 3 coins on, then I use tracing paper, and I put the tracing paper on top of that, and then I start drawing the embellishments over top of the coins on the tracing paper. That way, as I'm working the shapes of the embellishments, I can erase those without erasing the coins. And sometimes, you know, for certain objects, if you've seen some of the Arcanum X illustrations, the vines or whatever, or the buds of the flowers go over the stem of the glass, let's say, or part of the stick for the stabs. So I don't want to keep erasing and redrawing the lines of the objects. I want to focus on the embellishments. So that's why the tracing paper. So the tracing paper goes on top, and then once I'm satisfied with that, then the tracing paper goes under the paper that has the objects, and then I draw them all together and finalize it. And then once I finalize the pencil lines for all of that, then I outline it in ink. So that's the 3 of coins outlined in ink. And in this case, you know, there's no overlapping. And in a classical 3 of coins, there isn't any overlapping of the coins and the vines. But the buds inside, the flowers inside the coins, I do at that point also. And then after inking the design, I scan it into my computer, and then I color it by computer in Photoshop. So it's several steps. It doesn't take too long to do a card once I've decided which plants I'm going to feature on that card, and once I figure out the layout and spacing of the objects. A couple others that I think some of you may not have seen yet. I won't show them colored in, but I will show you the cards themselves. Here is the 8 of Cups. It's got chrysanthemums on it. I really like that one. And the 9 of Cups with, oh, sorry, I have to back up, with wisterias on it. So that one's going to be really pretty because wisterias are purple, and then the leaves are green. It's going to be really nice. So that's an update on Arcanum X. And honestly, every springtime, spring is kind of when since it's been a couple of years since I started Arcanum X, springtime is the time when I kind of get more inspired to do more work on it, or at least some research to figure out which plants are going to go on which cards and stuff. I pretty much have that figured out by now, but it does change once in a while. So anyway, as I said, that's an update on Arcanum X, and yeah. So thank you to everyone who's been asking me about it and everyone who's excited about it. Because I'm excited about it too. I just have other projects. You know, I've got a couple of yoga books that I want to write. I've got other tarot decks I want to design. I've got to figure out how to make money now that my job, like so many of us, our jobs have dried up overnight. So yeah. Anyway. I did primarily want to go live today to answer any questions you have about the Orbifold Tarot. It would be great if you could just type in any questions you have too, anyone who's here. Even actually, if you could say something in chat. I'm going to type this just in case you can't hear me to make sure you can hear me. But anyway, so the questions were, how's the progress on the Orbifold book? Because I did also announce an upcoming Orbifold book. I think I announced it last January-ish, last January or February-ish. Again, it's kind of the same answer. Is especially for the Orbifold book, I really want to put out an Orbifold book because there are things that have kind of developed naturally. Part of it. They developed naturally as I was designing the deck, but also now that the deck is finished and it's been out, and I've been, oh great, good, so you can hear me? Okay, good, glad you're here, hi. Yeah, so I wanted to put out an Orbifold book because I've kind of just developed ways of reading with the Orbifold that I think are unique to that deck, and they're techniques that can be applied to other tarot decks, but just I don't think I would have kind of evolved into that style or those techniques if it weren't for just the structure of the Orbifold. So, and there are some other things that I've just discovered that are intrinsic to the Orbifold that are just interesting and unique. That some of them I planned, and some of them I'm like, oh, I didn't plan that, but that works out really well. That's really interesting. And there are things that you might not discover on your own. So those are the kind of things that I want to put in the book. But at the same time, the Orbifold was created because I wanted to do away with all of that. This card means this, and this is how you're supposed to read tarot, and all of that kind of stuff. It's like I wanted to get rid of that for myself. That's why I designed it. It was for myself. I wanted a clean slate. But because that's the ethos behind the deck, it's tricky to like define things and not do it in a way that comes across as this is how this card is read. And while I respect and appreciate when people say, oh well, I want to read the definition of this card from the creator. I want to honor what the creator felt about this card, especially majors, but also other cards too. And I appreciate that, and I understand that, because one of the reasons why you buy a deck, any kind of deck, is to get that artist's perspective on tarot or whatever form of cartomancy they have. Same with Lenormand and other formats. So um, I get that, but then at the same time, it's like, well, I made it so that you can figure out your own definitions for judgment. But then at the same time, judgment, for instance, is air and earth, and that may go completely against your personal view of uh, what elemental association judgment is. Like, why would it be air and earth? Um, and so those are the kind of things that I wanted to get into in the book. And then there's a lot of theoretical, like particle physics, like stuff that's really cool that I love. That's interesting about the orbifold. And I mean, orbifolds as a scientific thing are these funny, like manifold things, and you can't really talk about orbifolds without multiple dimensions and folded up space and complex geometry and all that kind of stuff. And it gets very heady, especially when I'm writing about it, as opposed to just talking about it. Um, and sometimes the answer to that is, oh, well, just write the way you speak. Well, that's easier said than done. It's nice when writers can write in a communicative, conversational way that's accessible. But once things are on paper, it's much easier to see how things are organized. Whereas when you're speaking, you can kind of go in and out and all that kind of stuff. So, so anyway, so that's just the challenge that I'm facing with the Orbifold book. Is stepping away from it enough to be able to gain clarity, to go back into it. And I do want to go into those like weird particle physics things, and combine them with how physics and esotericism combine, and how that affects numerology, and how that affects how we read tarot and all of that. Like, that's all part of the orbifold. That's all part of stuff that I love, and that I do want to share, and that I do want to communicate. But at the same time, I don't want to write a book about physics. Like, I'm not a physicist, so it's just kind of treading that line, and it takes a lot of mental energy to tread that line as I'm writing, and keep it all clear and organized. And so again, with the Orbifold book, it's coming. I'm excited about it, but it's also for the moment on hold. So the second question about the Orbifold was, and I may need to think about this for a minute. When two cards are the composite and or missing major, I'm going to have to explain a little bit of what composite and missing majors are. Do you use both of them or just one? If you use just one, how do you select which one to use? So, for example, you do a 3-card draw, and let's say you get King of Fire, 2 of Fire, and 3 of Air. So you've got what I would calculate. You've got air and fire. Simply speaking, you've got air and fire. So one of the techniques that I've used, a lot of people will sometimes add the cards in a spread to get the major, and they'll do that numerologically. So depending on how you add your numbers, this kind of worked out funny. Oh, no, it didn't quite, almost. Depending on how you, yeah, no, it did. So depending on how you add your numbers, you might get a different major. So in that example, King of Fire, if you different people take different numbers for the court cards, but let's say your kings are 14, and then you add your 2 and your 3, the 2 of fire and the 3 of air. That adds up to 19. It would equal the sun. So the sun would kind of be the major that you would use to sort of influence or add to or sum up that 3-card reading. I use that technique when I'm using regular tarot cards if I need more information or if I need a summation or whatever. Um, but what I've been doing since the beginning is actually using that technique to find the major, but not numerologically. I add up the elements that are present in the spread to find the major, kind of the overarching theme major. So in that example, which I totally wasn't planning at all, but it worked out that way, it would also add up to the sun because you've got fire and air, and there are 2 majors in the Orbifold that have fire and air, and that's strength and the sun. So so it add up to be the sun, and I call that the composite major because it's the composite um, of the elements that are present in the spread. So in the question is about, so since there are 2 majors that share that combination of elements, which do you choose? Do you choose strength or do you choose the sun? Now, there's some reasons why I chose to put those 2 elements with those 2 cards, because I think the sun and strength are kind of reflections of each other. I mean, in a lot of ways, you could take any 2 majors and find reflections of each other in them. Like any 2 majors you could take and you could set them side by side and you could find, reflection of this in that. And that's a useful exercise too. Just a useful tarot exercise is take a major and then set another major beside it and find the parallels and find the contrasts, the parallels and the contrasts, and how do they pair up and how do they kind of complement each other. And then do the same with the same original major, but put a second major and see. And so, that's kind of inherent in the system. But for strength and for the sun, I really see them as very closely linked, just again as an example. And that's why they share that elemental balance. So, yeah. So how would you choose which to use? If you have a spread that is very clearly air and fire, so the composite major is strength or the sun, how would you choose? Am I going to use strength as my arching theme, or am I going to use the sun as my arching theme? You can do both. You can use both. You can use neither. You can go with the one that you feel is more accurately sums up the spread. You can challenge yourself and use the one that doesn't feel like it more accurately sums up the spread, but it may give you a greater insight. Because I think it's when we challenge ourselves, when we go just that little bit out of the box, where it makes sense, but it just barely doesn't make sense. It forces our brain to make new connections, and that's, I think, where the magic happens in any kind of cartomancy. It's the links we make, but then it's that pause, that moment of, why that card? Like sometimes we'll pull a card and it's like, well, of course, and there's that instant, that dawn of, well, duh. And so there isn't that pause. But there's like a clarity, there's like a revelation that happens in that moment. But just as equally, there are those moments when you pull a card and you're like, why that card? That doesn't make any sense right now at all. Like, what the fuck, And and it's in that pause, in that challenge, that in that strain to make a connection, that I think the really interesting stuff happens when we're reading. So it's kind of a non-answer and answer. So which do you choose, the sun or strength? Well, you choose the one that either makes more sense or is going to challenge you more, or you choose the one that, based on other elements in the spread, make more sense. So in my example of King of Fire, Two of Fire, Three of Air, if you add it up numerologically, it adds up to the sun. So I would choose the sun as the composite major in that instance. If it was same first card, King of Fire, but um, Eight of Air and Eight of Earth, Eight of Air and Eight of Fire, so two eights or two fours, then I would go, oh, strength, because two fours adds up to eight, and then I would negate the court card, um, and or two eights just is like a reminder. It just says like, hey, eight is a factor here. Eight is important. So in that case, I would choose strength. So it's more like a case by case scenario. There's no exact formula of which one to choose. Um, and then the missing major is basically the same. So the missing major is, I find that sometimes to find the solution, sometimes a spread will describe a problem really well, but it doesn't give you a solution. I mean, unless that's built into the spread where, oh, this card means the solution. But that's not always the case. Sometimes it just describes a situation and you're like, well, yeah, that's what's going on. And it may give you more insight into what's going on, but it may not give you any solutions, any answers of how you should proceed in that situation or how to balance that situation. So in a spread that's air and fire, the missing major is the sum of the elements that are absent, that are missing. So that would be the hermit in this case, or the star. And again, we can see many different parallels between different cards, but in that particular instance, I would go, well, the star is a closer balance, a closer reflection of the sun. So if you chose the sun as your composite major, then I would choose the star to balance it. It's just a personal preference, but in that case, I would do that. Same with strength and the hermit, right? I would kind of pair those together. So the balance, the solution, the way to balance out that dominance of fire and air is maybe to look more toward the aspects of the star. So yeah, I mean, I'm sure I could go on and on. I don't know how clear that was, but I could go on and on. And actually, in that instance, there's a really interesting thing that happens. I forget what I call it, but in adding up the elements, because there's a bit of a bias in the added elements cards, you're very often going to get 2 or 3 elements in a spread, especially if you're drawing 3 cards. One of my favorite ways to work is 3 or 4 cards, but often I'll do a 3-card spread. And so you're more likely to get 2 or 3 elements in a 3-card spread. You're not very likely to get 1 element. Like, that would be a rare instance. And there are 4 cards in the Orbifold that are only 1 element: the Fool, the Devil, the moon, and justice. I went in that order because it's elemental. So the fool is air, the devil is fire, the moon is water, and justice is earth. So it would be very rare that you would get a 3-card spread where your composite major is the fool. It happens, but it's not as common as getting air and fire, or air and water, let's say. So there's a bit of a bias there, an imbalance in the deck in that sense. And so to balance it out, it can be helpful sometimes. I don't do this every time, but it can be helpful sometimes to negate some of the elements in the spread. And that's actually even more the case when you're doing larger, let's say 4 or 5 cards, when your likelihood of getting 3 or 4 elements is higher. Because there's also an imbalance in the deck where there's only 4 cards that have 3 elements each. That's the Empress. I'm going to go into not really in order. The Empress, the Hanged One, the Tower, and I've forgotten. Sorry, there's one. Empress, Tower, Hanged One. I forget. I'm sorry. I'm not going to waste your time from me trying to remember. But there's 3 cards that have 3 elements, or 4 cards that have 3 elements each. So you're going to get a lot of 3-element spreads. And so your composite major is going to be the Empress, the Tower, the Hanged One. Now it's going to bug me if I can't figure out what that 4th one is. Sorry, I have to look at my deck because it's going to bug me. You can tell I haven't been as much in Orbifold land lately. I'll find here. I'll find it quick. So we have the Tower, the Empress, Temperance. How could I forget Temperance? So you're going to get those 4 cards as your composite major often. So it means like if you were pulling even from a majors only deck, you're not going to get the Tower all that often. Like you're going to get the Tower statistically 1 out of 21 times. I mean, you might get it a couple of times in a row, but not that often. Whereas if you do the composite, you're going to get more often, more than 1 out of 21 times, you're going to get an air card, a fire card, and an earth card, where those 3 elements are present. So you're going to get the Tower often. And it can be a little disconcerting because you're like, my composite major is the Tower like all the time. What's going on? So, you know, that can be a little bit frustrating sometimes. It forces you to look at those 4 cards a little bit more deeply, which is great. But then you end up with a deeper understanding of those 4 cards and maybe not as deep an understanding of certain other cards because they're not coming as often. So to balance that, like one of the ways to balance that is, let's say it is the Tower, just because I just used that as an example. The missing major would be the Moon. The Moon is like the soother of the Tower. It's the Moon balances the Tower. And you know, likewise, the Empress, which is earth, fire, water, is balanced by the Fool, the innocence of the Fool. Like in a lot of ways, that the birth, whatever the Empress gives birth to, whether it's a person or a concept or a creative endeavor or whatever it is, the result of that is kind of the Fool, actually. You know, that fresh new thing. And so they kind of complement each other. But then there's also at least one card, depending on whether you're using all uh, the traditional majors, or if you're using also the two additional majors that are in the Orbifold, Void and Manifestation. Um, so there's at least one card that has no elements, and that's Death, and the Void if you use it. So that means that in all of these additive, composite, missing, whatever major, I mean, unless you get 4 elements, then the missing major would be Death. Like if you get the Magician, then the missing major is Death. I guess. Um, but you're going to get even more rarely, you're going to get Death as a presence in the readings, and that's also a bit imbalanced. Like death is part of the arcana for a reason. It needs to be there. It's still going to be kind of rare in this method, but one of the methods to kind of swing death, bring death a little bit more into the equation, death and the void, is by negating the element. Whenever there's an element that's doubled, you negate it. So going back to that original example of the King of Fire, two of fire, 3 of air, I count court cards as their rank and their element. So you would have air for king, fire for what he's ruling over. So air, fire, then you have the 2 of fire, which is another fire, and then you have the 3 of air, which is another air. So you actually have 2 air cards and 2 fire cards, even though there's only 3 cards. But it's actually 2 air and 2 fire. So they actually cancel each other out. It's a binary system. So air and fire have canceled each other out. So in that case, the secret major is death. So that's kind of cool. That brings in another element. That also takes a little bit care of those one element majors that don't show up as often. So take the devil, for instance. The devil's not going to show up it's not very often that you'll pull 3 fire cards, like all fire. It could happen, but it won't happen that often. Although it might happen the opposite, that you would pull water, earth, and air, and then you're balancing, your missing major would be the devil. But to balance that out further, let's say instead of King of Fire for our first card in that example, let's say it was 10 of air, 2 of fire, 3 of air. Then we have 2 air cards and 1 fire card. So we negate, it still comes out as our composite major is the sun or strength. Our missing major is still the hermit or the star. But the 2 air cards negate each other, and all that's left is a fire card. And so your secret major is the devil. So that can lead to a really interesting reading. Well, what if the reading really was the overarching theme is the sun, your solution is the star, but then the secret, kind of like the underlying issue, the thing that's like lurking beneath it all, is the devil. That's actually really interesting reading. That the details of the whatever cards initially came up could be really interesting, but it just gives you more and more layers. And with such a minimal deck like the Orbifold, where there isn't, all these little details of a hat or a hand gesture or a feather or the direction that someone's looking, or any of those, are the chains loose or are the chains tight, or, which side is the fire, the torch on, all those kind of details, they're absent from the Orbifold. So you can't rely on any of those things. I mean, you could recall them from other decks that you use, and that's totally fine, but they're not physically in the card. Um, there's some symbols in there, but there's not so many. So um, that can permit you a lot of intuitive freedom, a lot of that recall of, well, use any devil card that you've got in your bank, in your memory bank, or any of the principles of the devil archetype in your memory bank. That's totally fine. But then if you like draw a blank at all and you're like, oh well, this card gives me, a 10 of air, gives me this much information, and then I'm stuck because it's just 10 yellow orbs, and you're like, oh well, what else? Then you can incorporate all of these other techniques of composite major and missing major and absent major and blah, whatever it is. Um, and then it gives you nuance, and you can still use the cards that are on the table. The cards that you drew are still the main theme, but everything, all of those other majors that are associated in some way, just give you layers, and it enables you to get a very full reading, um, without necessarily having to draw more cards. So some readers, for even like a 10 or 15-minute reading, they'll throw 40 cards on the table. That's totally fun. I'm cool with that. Like I don't have any issues with any of these techniques. They're all good. If it works for you, they're all good. Um, but conversely, sometimes you can draw one card or two cards or sometimes three cards, and that can be a 1 hour, very deep meaning. And especially with the Orbifold, with the kind of nuance of tying those majors in elementally, can give all those layers. So that's a really long answer for not such a simple question, but probably a more complex answer than it needs to be. That's okay. Next question. So, from what I understand, at some point, maybe it's even on the fold out, I don't remember. At some point, I said that the number 7 relates to abstraction. I don't really remember saying that, although I must have. So this person asked, can you elaborate on what you meant by abstraction with the number 7? Yeah, well, I mean, the seven is an abstract. It's an abstract number. It's an uneven. It's a very uneven number. Um, I mean, it's uneven because it's an odd number. I mean, 7, right? It's not 6 and it's not 8, but it's so abstract. Like even in music, you get all kinds of time signatures from actually 1 to 10. I mean, you don't get one. You don't usually get 1, 4, or whatever, but you'll get 3, 4 time often, and so that's 3 beats per bar. Quarter note gets the bar, gets the beat, and you know that's very common. Or 2, 4 time is very often. 4, 4 is very often. 5, 4 is even pretty common, but not so common because it is a bit odd. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's an odd musical signature, um, but it's not even as odd as 7. Like 7 as a time signature in music, as a beat, 7 beats per bar. That's just weird. It's done, but it's weird, and it's usually seen in more abstract music. So similarly, like when we're dividing things, when you divide art, when you divide a canvas, when you're planning art, like, kind of like when I was talking about how I work planning the Arcanum X illustrations, it's very weird. It's very rare that I would divide my paper, my canvas, into 7 sections. 5 maybe. 4, yeah, lots. 3, lots. 6, pretty often, because 3 and 2, pretty often. 8, also very often. 9 even, pretty often, right? 9 is a square, 3 by 3 square, right? So art is very often organized in twos. One, of course, is the whole painting or whatever. Um, Seven is a bit of an abstraction um, for a canvas. Although, interestingly, human figures are considered classically. A human figure is usually drawn as 7 heads tall. So if you take my head and you take that height and go boom, 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 all the way down, allegedly, classically, we're supposed to be around 7 of these tall. Most people aren't. But that's kind of a classical measurement. But yeah, so abstraction of the 7, it's a movement from organization to out of organization into a different form of organization. Now, 7 we see very often in our in our regular lives as being 7 days a week. That's really common. And so it may not seem like an abstraction, but kind of, I don't know. I never understood 7 days a week. To me, I'm always like, by the time Monday comes around, I'm like, I'd rather 5 days on and 3 days off, or something like I'd rather an 8-day week or a 6-day week, even. Something. It's odd. It's an abstraction. But even when you go so the 6 kind of represents community, and 8 is like super organized. 8 is super structured. The 7 is like this weird thing that fits somehow weird in there. But it allows for that break. It allows for that shift from kind of a communal organization to a more solid organization at the 8, and allows for a lot more movement. So movement isn't necessarily abstract in and of itself, but it does abstract that wholeness, that harmony, that peace almost of the 6. The 7 breaks that, and so that's, I guess, what I mean by abstraction of being related to 7. Blah 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 blah. Hey, this live stuff's great. I can just babble and babble and babble, which I'm really good at doing. So next question. Could you explain the meaning of the black backgrounds for the majors, white backgrounds for the minors, and what the meaning of the black and white are, and the meaning of their positions when they're integrated into the image or border? That's, I mean, partly that was just a design choice, just to yeah, it was just kind of initially it was just a design choice, just to differentiate between the majors and the minors. Although, of course, everything, as the deck developed, everything kind of developed its own meaning. White represents light to me, so it's like an additional element. Fire and light are closely related because fire generates light. But to me, light is really a different element. It's not fire. Because light, again, even though light contains heat and they're related, fire is really more heat to me, whereas light is illumination, and it doesn't necessarily have to contain heat in that sense. I mean, light always has heat to a degree. An infrared light is heat and not light that we can register with our eyes. So there is that really close relationship between heat and light. but light really represents also illumination. And again, like a lot of people associate that with fire. Illumination, the spiritual spark, is related to fire. But I don't know. Light to me is like an element that exists outside of those four major elements. Um, in a way, it's kind of a refinement. Um, but then black is space, which is its own element. You know, in Vedic thought, in Eastern thought, um, there are five elements, and conscious element, consciousness or light, is a different thing altogether. But everything has to have space before it can exist. Air has to have space to exist in. Earth has to have a space to exist in. Even when you strip all those elements away, when you take water out of a glass, even if you put a vacuum and you suck all the air out of the glass, there's still space. There's still something there, and that's space, and that's an element. That's like a tangible element. It's not a spiritual thing. I mean, it's all spiritual, but it's not like this intangible. Because a lot of times in Western thought, the fifth element is considered spirit, and I don't necessarily have a problem with that. That's perfectly useful way of looking at things. But there really is an actual fifth element that is space. That is not air, it's not fire, it's not water, it's not earth, it's space. And for all of those four other elements to exist in, space must exist first. And so that's the void. The void is illustrated with the white dot in it, with light, because there is that spark of consciousness. Again, in Vedic thought, consciousness kind of precedes it all. I mean, it depends on the way you look at it. But so yeah, so that's the void. The void is like the space that opens, that is filled with nothing, but it's not nothing. It's space. It's something. It's just not filled with any other tangible element. It allows the possibility for all to exist. Nothing can exist without a space to exist within. And yet it's just that space. There's nothing there. There's nothing tangible existing in it, but it allows for that space. So the majors to me, they're more concepts than actual tangible things. They're concepts that relate to tangible things, but they're not really tangible. So they're kind of floating in space, you know, in a way. They're floating in this. They're opening the space for things to exist, but they don't really exist. Any of the majors. They're concepts, they're archetypes, they're ideals. And so putting the majors on black backgrounds is kind of saying, here's the space for this concept to exist in, even though it doesn't really exist. It's this concept is opening up space for things to exist. Whereas on the minors, they're already illuminated. They're already in existence to be shed light on. They already exist. They're already there. You just have to turn your consciousness to them. You have to turn your awareness to them. So I guess that's the difference between the white and black on the majors and minors. And then in the borders, it takes on a funny, different sense, because in the borders and in the shading of the orbs, black actually, it full circle. I mean, the orbifold is it's like, it's loopy. right? It circles back around. It's paradoxical. So in in that sense, black represents full tangibility, full manifestation. Um, the borders on all the cards, like the lower the number, the lighter the border, the higher the number, the darker the border, or it grows darker. So, for instance, comparing one and 10 of air, or I can put it more easily. I can put my hand more. Oh no, there we go. So 1 to 10. So the border of the ace goes lighter, and it's a pure yellow. It's like light, the concept, not just white, but the concept of light illumination to air, and that's it. And then 10 goes light illumination around the border to air, to the full manifestation, the full growth of air. It's tangible. It's most dense. I mean, air isn't really that dense. Air can be thick and heavy and all that, depending on the gases. But it the black in that case gives it weight. So where the majors are on black because they're creating space for this, intangible concept to exist, black on the other cards give it weight and tangibility. And then it gets full circle again, because then we could also say, in a way, we could say that the majors give weight to everything. There are these abstract concepts that are like way off in space, and yet at the same time, one of the reasons why we incorporate missing and composite and absent majors and secret majors, whatever, is that when we associate a major to a reading that maybe doesn't have a major, it gives it weight. It pulls it down and makes it tangible, even though the major itself might be this weird, abstract, intangible thing. I should be a politician because that's totally circular talk, but that again, that's the orbifold. The orbifold is this circular thing that where on one level something's totally intangible and totally unreal, on another level it's totally real, and then the reverse, on one level where something's totally tangible and totally true and totally like fixed, on a different level it doesn't exist. Like we're finding out right now with money. Money doesn't exist. Money is a concept. All these countries that are shutting down and worried about their economies, money doesn't exist. People exist. People, we're all here. We're all here. We're not working, many of us, but we're all here. And the money that we spend on our rent and on our utilities and on our fucking taxes and all that stuff, I mean, it seems very real. Like, it seems very real when that's missing suddenly. Like, oh, where is my next $10 or my next $20 coming from? I know that feeling. That feels very real. That's tangible. That's Earth. Like, that's 10 of Earth weight. And yet at the same time, it's imaginary. Like, will the world stop spinning? Will the actual Earth stop spinning if nobody pays their rent? If landlords don't pay their mortgages? If banks don't collect the interest on all those mortgages? Yeah, Earth's still gonna spin. Like, it's totally this fantasy world that we invest so much. So it's like, it's not just the orbifold that's circular and tangible on one level and totally intangible on another. It's life. I mean, life is real. I mean, until it's not, like, until we're dead, then it's not. And we have lots of ideas about what happens when we die, and um, some of them may be true and some of them may be not. But really, none of us really know. We exist for a while and then we don't. Um, and so we're all like constantly the embodiment of that paradox. And that's the fun of it. Like that's the play. Like again, kind of in Vedic terms, that's the lila. That's the lila, the Maya of it. Is it's all illusory, and yet it's real. Like it's real, and then that doesn't mean don't take things seriously. Don't take what's happening lightly right now. It's serious. Like it is serious, um, but it's serious only on certain levels, and that doesn't dismiss the reality that it is on one level or many levels. But at the same time, it is unreal. It is like a fantasy, like a dream. Like it's just and that is definitely not to say, "Oh, well, it's just a fantasy, so just ignore it." No, definitely not. Um, but it's just it's a paradox. Life is a paradox, money is a paradox, the Orbifold tarot is a paradox, and yeah, you do the best and you make the best sense of it all that you can, and you know, the rest we wait and see. Um, so I mean, wow, I didn't expect to talk about that, but I'm sure some of those concepts are on a lot of people's minds lately. Maybe not the same perspective on those concepts that I have, but a lot of people, I'm sure, are thinking about those things. And yeah, so I think I'll end it there. And so thanks for everyone who came to witness this ramble-a-thon. And if you all enjoyed it, share it. I'll make it shareable soon. Um, and enjoy. And I'm gonna, I don't know. I mean, obviously, I like talking. So if you enjoyed it, I enjoyed it, and I'll try to do it relatively regularly. We'll see if we can make it a regular thing. And please do feel free to ask your questions. Send me your questions on Mirrors of Consciousness on Facebook, um, or here on YouTube, or however you like. And I'll try to make it a regular thing, and I'll try to answer your questions about, well, whatever I'm going to babble about. So take care. Keep your physical distance from everybody as much as you can, but keep social distance to a minimum, by finding alternative ways of being social and connecting with people. But maybe also use this time to be a hermit and not be social, and that's okay. Let your loved ones know that you're okay. Check in with them just so that they're not panicked that they haven't heard from you. But hermiting is actually really good when we can, when we have the luxury. Some of us don't have that luxury, but yeah. Anyway, see y'all next time.